For decades, Hollywood films and science fiction writers have told us ominous stories about the future dangers of killer robots and artificial intelligence. Today's guest warns that machines lack the essential human qualities required for operating weapon systems, and he's working to ban them from doing just that. He's Peter Asaro this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Lutis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University. Alongside me is my friend and co-host, G. Wayne Miller of the Providence Journal. Story in the Public Square is an effort to study, celebrate, and tell stories that matter. To do that, we sit down every week with the best storytellers around, filmmakers, authors, journalists, and scholars, to make sense of the big stories that shape public life in the United States today. To help us this week, we're joined by Peter Asaro, an associate professor of the School of Media Studies at the New School in New York. He's also a co-founder of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control. Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
There's a lot, as we were saying just before we started here. This is AI and artificial intelligence and automation warfare. These are big issues that we've wanted to talk to you. But for folks at home who maybe don't know what a philosopher of science and technology does, in basic terms, what is it that you do?
Well, mostly I think about the ways in which technology is going to impact society, what kinds of social, political, ethical issues that are raised. My background is both as a philosopher of science, but I also studied computer science, machine learning, artificial intelligence, worked in a robotics company for a while, doing computer vision and things like that, and thinking about what the implications of robotics and automation and artificial intelligence are going to be, and sort of focused more on that.
And not just on the issues of automation and warfare, right? Broader?
Much broader, yeah. All the ways in which, automating human decisions changes the nature of those decisions, especially when they have ethical, moral, legal implications for people. And so that question of should you automate certain sorts of things, and if you are going to automate those things, how do you ensure that there's the right kind of accountability and responsibility that goes into automated decision making?
So when you look at when you think about the future of technology, what does the future portend? What's coming our way?
Well, there's a whole lot of hype around artificial intelligence right now and machine learning, because you've got lots of data being collected through personal devices and computers and things like that, and all of that can be mined for business purposes, for government purposes, for all sorts of things.
But there's a difference too, right, between big data and data analytics and AI.
Yes and no, right? I mean, one way to think about AI is that it's analytics and statistics on steroids, right? That it's hyper automating all of this decision making, and you can just feed lots of data in, because now the algorithms can find patterns on their own in many cases. And so there's a lot less human labor involved in doing the analytics on data. And we collect a lot more data, so that scales. And that's where all these financial advantages really kind of come in. And the idea that you can optimize systems that would otherwise be too expensive and laborious to optimize.
So let's look at the collection of data. You're talking about a number of sources, many of which we voluntarily give up to, for example, Facebook or Twitter or Amazon, or when we go to Home Depot or whatever. I mean, that's an enormous amount of data. You're talking this kind of data and more?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, right now, if you think about your kind of browsing and search history on the internet, that's a certain kind of data. If you think about your phone, it's also tracking your location and all sorts of other things about your behavior, even when you're not using it. And we could also see that, as cameras become more sophisticated, they're going to be tracking your eye as you look through a web page. So they'll actually know which parts of the web page are attracting your attention, and they'll be able to optimize advertisements or other sorts of information to that pattern, knowing what you're actually interested in on a web page.
Also your TV viewing. We're at home surfing Netflix, Amazon, regular channels and whatever. That is data all being collected by those respective parties.
And if you think about what Nielsen was able able to do a decade or two ago in terms of just knowing which programs families were looking at across the country versus now being able to specifically know what you as an individual are watching, how long you're watching it, when you're changing the channel, when you're pausing or doing picture-in-picture.
Really
all
down
of
to
that's
that
being
level of
collected.
detail.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Do you think most people, and most people's a large group of people, but do you think people in general understand that all of their viewing, all of their buying, all of what we talked about here is being collected, or they just do it the way you get in the car and drive and maybe don't know the cameras are watching you on the road?
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of sleepwalking into it a little bit. I think because it's hidden, you don't think about it as much because you don't see it happening. Like when somebody at the grocery store asks you for your account number or your phone number, you're often like, oh, I don't want to give you that information.
Yeah.
But if it's a computer that's automatically taking it off of your browser, you don't think about it. Where robotics is actually a little bit different because we see robots out in the world, and if we see a robot flying around taking pictures, we're actually hypersensitive to that and like, it's spying on me. But we don't pay attention to that quiet little camera that might be sitting over the doorway of a store.
So what is the relationship between people and technology today? Where is it headed, and where should we be wanting it to head? I guess those are three separate questions, right? We've got only 27 minutes too, so
27 minutes. Well, I mean, my work really focuses on the where should we want it to go question. That a lot of times technology sort of barrels forward. Like we can do certain things, engineers see certain possibilities of connecting things that are built and pushing the technology forward, and they may see a business opportunity or something like that in it, but ultimately they're not thinking through all of the sort of social implications of how that's going to transform interpersonal relationships, social relationships, political and economic relationships, which are complex and hard to foresee. So a lot of what I try to do is figure out what are those implications going to be, how do we start thinking about developing norms and ethics around them so that we can actually devise the kind of society that we want to live in, because it's going to be an incredibly powerful transformation in society that all these technologies will bring, and we should define what that is.
So in 2016 we saw what psychographic targeting and political advertising could do. What's the future for the democracy in this world of AI? And I mean, it's one thing if it's a Russian troll sort of pretending to be an American, but if you've got a series of machines that are behaving like human beings, what does this mean for the future of democracy?
I think it's a real challenge. On the one hand, trying to think how do you maybe control news to ensure that it's not fake, that it's authentic? How do you actually convey to people the authenticity or veracity of news versus the ability to shape large groups of people over social media, not even just through fake news, but through sort of disinformation. I teach a seminar on digital war where we're looking at this very issue of information warfare, which has gone on for many decades, but again is really being empowered by this kind of targeted marketing technology to be much more powerful than it's ever been before.
You used an interesting term. You said we should design this future. And by we, I assume you mean the American people or the people of the world. And yet we have Mark Zuckerberg, who is not we. And we have the people running Google and Alphabet who are not we. And I could go through a long list. How, in a democracy, does the we come into the free market and make that future something that we design, not the people who have a profit motive design?
I think that's another big challenge. Thinking about how do you design systems, how do you get transparency or access or public civil society views, the public good represented within that when you have most of that innovation taking place in private companies. Most of that's proprietary, so it's even protected from legal visibility in many cases. Yeah, that's a huge challenge. Part of that could be ethics review boards within companies. Google has looked a little bit at that. We're seeing, I think, a movement of tech workers in multiple companies, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, who are protesting what they see as unethical. In Google, there was the protest against Project Maven, which was a program to use AI to analyze data feeds from drones for the Pentagon. There has also been a big backlash against the development of Dragonfly, which was a kind of censored Google search for the Chinese market. There's been protests at these other companies as well. So we're starting to see some movement there, and more along the lines of traditional labor organizing.
So should these companies, should the big tech companies face more regulation?
Probably, yeah. The question, of course, then is what kind of regulation and who. So there's been proposals for things like a robot regulatory commission at the federal level. Could you do something like that for artificial intelligence? Is it separable enough, or do you need to have it maybe an AI branch within transportation to look at self-driving cars, and within the health to look at medical applications, and within the FCC to look at communications, or FTC to look at trade. The FTC, because a lot of these are commercial applications, already regulates to a certain extent, but it follows, these very traditional kind of software things that we've seen before. So you consent to share your information, and the end user agreements and things like that, which I think are very ineffective for really communicating the implications of these technologies to users.
I mean, there certainly is long historical precedent for government regulation and oversight of technological industries. I often refer to the automobile industry, where safety standards and emissions and so forth and so on. So it can be done. There's nothing here inherently, just because it's a sophisticated new technology, that says, oh, we can't do it, it's out of our hands. Is there any appetite in Washington now, in 2018, to do that? And also on the state level, and I guess that's a separate discussion. We could look at California compared to other states, but let's start at the federal level. Do you see any desire to do that in this current environment?
I see a real challenge to getting any kind of substantive legislation through the current Congress.
On any issue.
On any issue.
Yeah.
I think much everyone in America would agree with that.
To the extent that this is not yet a politicized issue, that might be an advantage. I think there's a growing sense of distrust and concern around those kind of big tech companies and the amount of power that they wield, and what's going to be the stance of government against that. And we've had rounds of hearings of the kind of CEOs of Facebook and Amazon and Google and Microsoft showing up at Congress to explain themselves.
But there doesn't seem to be consensus or even agenda on the left or the right about what the appropriate role of government in this new era is.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and there's the strong sense, the pro-business, so that these are the innovators, these are the companies that are making
give them
lots of money.
free opportunity to.
So we don't want to inhibit that. We don't want to shut down successful industry. On the other hand, there's the privacy issues. So you start thinking about what it would mean to really do the evaluation of social media posts under any kind of government regulatory structure. What does that mean for free speech? So those are huge issues that I think will continue to govern that sort of discussion.
Well, let's turn to the military sphere, where robotics, artificial intelligence, and technology, as we've been discussing, are very much a part of the current military scene. Can you just sort of briefly sketch out what is happening with both robotics and artificial intelligence, starting with the U.S. military?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of development in recent years towards increasing autonomy in systems, and particularly military systems. So we're familiar with drones that are remote operated aircraft that can fire missiles and things like that, but those are still under human control. So there's a human operator who's looking through the videos, feeds, deciding what's a target, targeting the weapon, firing the weapon. They might be thousands of miles away, but it's under human control.
Those are Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all the images that we've seen in
Predator, Reaper.
Right, Predator drones, Reaper drones, things like that. But the next generation of drones are much more automated. So they're able to, of course, not only take off and land autonomously, but again, they're looking at how to analyze the video feed to automatically identify targets or things of interest. And then a few short steps later, you could fully automate that. And so an algorithm or a piece of software would be deciding, this is a target, I'm going to engage it with a weapon. And then a human might not be involved in that process at all, maybe as a remote kind of supervisor, maybe is supervising dozens of aircraft to a single individual. And this is what we're calling an autonomous weapon. So if you've automated targeting and engagement of the weapon system, it's an autonomous weapon.
That's the pulling of the trigger.
the pulling of the trigger, and the pointing of the weapon, right, which is itself a kind of act of aggression.
But that would seem to be fraught with great potential for error. I mean, the technology is not that great. This isn't God saying, yes, that's my ISIS target.
Right. So there's a whole host of issues that are raised by this. One is the accuracy or reliability of the system. How many mistakes is it going to make? How many civilians is it going to accidentally kill?
Yeah.
From a legal perspective, this is called discrimination, being able to discriminate between civilians and combatants. There's also questions of proportionality, knowing how much force should be applied in a given situation and what's justified under the law, and how much risk you're able to put civilians at as sort of collateral damage or unintended deaths that result from attacking a wanted target.
So I guess sort of a counter-argument to that would be you're not putting, in the case of this discussion, American troops in harm's way. I mean, that certainly was true for Predator drones and for this new generation.
The argument I've heard though is that this for like the remotely piloted vehicles, there's no Americans really in harm's way already. But the argument that I've heard is that if you want to be able to essentially stare at a target for however long you can keep that aircraft, in the air, or that series of aircraft over that target, using AI to be able to discriminate and see, sort of stare at that target indefinitely, it gets rid of human fatigue. It gets rid of frankly the cost of having a personnel on duty. There are a whole host of arguments in favor of the technology, but you say on balance that the moral and ethical and legal implications outweigh them.
I think so, particularly on this decision to pull the trigger, right,
Yeah.
to take a life. All sorts of things. The flying of the aircraft itself can be automated, getting to the destination, analyzing targets, even to a certain extent recommending potential targets, but you have to have then enough information that the human is really able to assess the situation and have a contextual understanding of what's happening before making a targeting decision. In many respects, drones have improved human decision making because you have more time to deliberate and study a target. There's more people in the room. You can consult with intelligence experts and lawyers before you target something. But if you think about eliminating all of that and just saying, we're just going to write an algorithm to do this and train it to do it really well, I think that's deeply problematic.
Is there a moral hazard of eliminating risk to the shooter?
I think there's a risk of lowering the thresholds to war. It would make it much easier to go to war because it seems more costless. It also seems likely that you're going to have a big accountability gap, because machines will be making these decisions. Humans will be deploying the machines without really knowing exactly what they're going to do and what they're going to target. And under international law of, say, war crimes, you have to demonstrate intent. So a machine that goes out and commits atrocities, the person who sent it out can say, I didn't know it was going to do that, and there's no way to hold them sort of accountable under that. You could loosely hold governments accountable for the systems that they deploy, but they can blame manufacturers, and you create this sort of wiggle room, an accountability gap for the legal system, which is perilous. And you also create, I think, a responsibility gap for the human who's deploying these systems, because they feel like, oh, well, the security and safety is built into the system, and I don't have to take responsibility for this.
You can't put a piece of software on the witness stand in a court of law.
Yeah, no, there's an Onion article that has that.
Of course there is.
How did you come to focus on these issues?
So I did a lot of work initially in the philosophy of mind, and then I kind of moved into the philosophy of science, looking at the history of cybernetics in the 1940s and 50s, and thinking about the embodiment of thought into machines. And that was my dissertation, worked in AI and machine learning, and to kind of fill out the modern version of it. And then really started thinking after my PhD about the ethical side of things.
So you're a co-founder of a couple of very interesting groups, the International Committee for Robot Arms Control and the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots. Tell us about both of those.
So because I'd done some work on social and emotional robots, I was invited to do an article on ethics of robots. So I started thinking about killer robots and whether or not we would allow robots to take human life autonomously as sort of the crucial moral question. Back in 2009, I got together with a couple of others, Noel Sharkey from the University of Sheffield, Jürgen Altman, and Rob Sparrow in Australia. We've formed the International Committee for Robot Arms Control. And at that point, it was just to raise awareness about the issue and try to get governments to act on it. A few years later, in 2012, we met up and linked up with Human Rights Watch and the Nobel Women's Initiative and a number of other NGOs who knew a lot about humanitarian disarmament and formed the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, which now has 11 NGOs on the steering committee, and we represent 76 NGOs internationally from 33 different countries.
So do I have this correct, that you're trying to bring a moral dimension into this technology? I mean, is that essentially what you're trying to achieve here?
I think our main goal is a legal one at this point,
Okay.
which is to get a treaty through the United Nations system that would be an international treaty that would prohibit autonomous weapons.
Really?
The other way to think about it is that it would require meaningful human control over all targeting and engagement. And we've had a series of meetings at the UN in Geneva over the past 6 years in the body called the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons.
Right.
Everything's a mouthful at the United Nations. CCW.
Yeah.
And then they elevated the informal expert meetings to a series of group of governmental expert meetings, which are formal. And the next step, which we're pushing for, would be to have a treaty negotiating mandate to add a new protocol to that treaty, which could then potentially ban autonomous weapons.
So give us a sense of, beyond the meetings, what's the position of the U.S. government on this, NATO, others around the world?
So there's about 127 countries who are party to the CCW. There's been large blocs that have come out in favor of a ban, Latin America, Africa, and a total, I think, of 26 countries now that have explicitly called for a ban. The big players in the room, of course, are the US, Russia, China, and they've had somewhat more difficult positions. So the U.S. position initially, they have an internal policy within the U.S. Department of Defense called the 3000.09.
And this predates the Trump administration, right?
This is from 2012. They actually came out with that report at the same time we came out with a report about killer robots the same week in 2012. And their initial policy seemed to be that they wanted a kind of set of best practices, soft law, following those guidelines, and enhanced weapons reviews. So they do what's under the Geneva Convention, Article 36. They review weapons for their lawfulness, whether they're discriminate and proportionate and can be used lawfully. And they want sort of enhanced versions of that. This last meeting, they seem to have backed away from that a little bit more and saying they're not even sort of sure that we need codes of conduct or best practices. Russia has said that we don't know what we're talking about. These weapons don't exist yet. We don't know what they're going to do. It's too early to do anything, and we shouldn't do anything. And then China has said that they're still not quite sure what we're talking about, but they do want to ban, but they want to ban on use, not necessarily a ban on development. So there's been other discussions around questions of dual use and whether a prohibition on autonomous weapons would impact other robotics and automation technologies.
Is this issue being driven by groups like yours, or is there anybody on the international? Is there a state or a government around the world that this is important to them?
Yeah, so there was a proposal tabled at the last meeting in Geneva in August from a coalition of Brazil, Austria, and Chile that called for a negotiating mandate. And that's been the sort of strongest statement so far on that. France and Germany tabled a proposal the previous year to have a political declaration, which would not be a non-legally binding declaration around the principles of human control and things like that. So NATO kind of is falling more in line with that view, I think, at this point.
So are these efforts and your efforts beginning to getting attention in the mass media, meaning reaching larger numbers of people than the parties intimately involved?
I think so. I mean, we call ourselves the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, and the media seems to like that. Although
it's a catchy title. Speaking as a member of the media, yes, it is.
Yeah. So we've been fairly lucky, I think, in that regard to raise awareness. I think it's challenging compared to other more historical arms control initiatives, say for landmines or cluster munitions, which had many victims. of those, the civilians who were unduly harmed by that technology, that you could present and say, look, this is why we need to ban them. This is still a future technology, thankfully, which I think makes it easier to ban because countries are not yet dependent on it. But it also makes it more challenging to raise the public awareness because you can't point to the exact sort of victims of the problem.
But it doesn't take much imagination to envision a future where this happens.
Well,
all you have to do is read dystopian fiction.
Well, and to the point, there is a huge body of film and literature about AI run amok, whether we're talking about HAL in the 2001 films or Terminator or take your pick. Are these stories helpful or not helpful to the kinds of conversations you're trying to promote?
Yeah, we can go all the way back to Metropolis.
Yes, absolutely.
I think they're helpful. They've also been used to attack the campaign or to say that what we're doing is hype and we're just stoking fears about Terminators and Skynet. But I don't think that's what we're doing at all. And I think it helps to sort of envision what those systems might look like and some of the consequences of it, to look at the science fiction and the dystopia. But what we're really talking about are very real weapons that are going to be used on battlefields in the very near future. And we don't have to worry about them taking over, but we do have to worry about who they're deciding to kill and why, and who's going to be responsible for that, and what kind of world that's going to be when warfare moves into that automated realm.
Peter Asaro, it's a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for being with us. He's Peter Asaro from the New School and the International Committee for Robot Arms Control. That's all the time we have this week, but if you want to know more about Story in the Public Square, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter, or visit pellcenter.org, where you can always catch up on previous episodes. He's G. Wayne Miller. I'm Jim Ludis, asking you to join us again next time for more Story in the Public Square.